There we go. Thank you. All right. Welcome everybody to another BSEC research chat. So today we have health and the inaugural presentation from the biogeochemistry theme team, whose previous name I honestly can't remember anymore because it's always just with biogeochemistry. So we're going to start off by hearing from health, and I think Emily's going to kick us off. So I won't waste any more time. Emily, go right ahead.
Awesome, thanks. Okay. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, great. Let's just make it on the screen. Oops. Okay, so I've been working with the Asthma Precision Medicine Center of Excellence, and we've been interested in learning about asthma exacerbations and environmental drivers of just showing out across the year. So this is looking just at adults in Maryland, and we see that maybe there's a nadir in the summer. It's not terribly pronounced, but we have about 5 asthma exacerbations per day on average in adults in Maryland. In kids, there are really strong patterns across the year where you get peaks in the spring, peaks in the fall when they're
Hey, Emily, I think,
and
is it
then the
me or is Emily
lowest rates
buffering?
in the summer.
It's not you.
And
I
Okay.
hear you.
just on the
Hey, Emily. We're having a little trouble with your connection. I don't know
yeah.
if you want to try turn video off or something so we just get the audio and screen. Let's see how that does for us.
Okay. Hope it works.
Sound good now.
I can also figure out. Okay, great. So looking just at kids across the year and asthma exacerbations, we see really strong patterns. With a spring peak, a back to school fall peak. We focused on the summer months because we were interested in heat, and we used a case crossover study design with time stratified control windows. And I'm happy to talk about the methods if anyone has questions. We identified about 3,000 asthma exacerbations among kids and adults. And so at the top here, you can see that they're about evenly split, with 1,000 coming from kids, about 1,000 coming from young adults, and then 1,000 coming from adults over 40. More boys have asthma exacerbations, and then once we get into adults, we see that they're more common among females. And they're more common among patients who are Black, which is consistent with known health disparities in asthma exacerbations. We were interested in seeing whether or not temperature was related with risk of asthma exacerbation. And so we used the PRISM data, and we calculated an area weighted exposure at the county level and assigned it to each patient. We did this for daily maximum, mean, and minimum temperature. And so you can see the distribution here of the temperatures. June on average has cooler temperatures, and then July and August are more comparable. And in blue, we see the distribution of minimum. Green is the mean temperature, and then red is the maximum daily temperature across our study period. We were also interested in learning about whether there were differences by socioeconomic disadvantage. So we linked patients to their area deprivation index, sort of a neighborhood level composite measure of socioeconomic disadvantage. And so you can see ADI on the right here, where the higher values correspond to more disadvantage, and those are the regions in red, and then blue would be less disadvantage. And then on the left, we have the distribution of asthma exacerbations among children. And this is consistent with where patients are coming from as well. Just more broadly in the asthma PIMCO, we see that they're concentrated around the hospital. So looking at temperature and looking at socioeconomic disadvantage, we see that there is an increased risk of asthma exacerbation on hotter days, and that increase is significant, specifically in younger adults. So looking here, we see that the rate is about 10% higher when daily maximum temperature increases by 5 degrees. A similar change in risk looking at daily mean, and then about a 5% increase in risk per 5-degree increase in minimum daily temperature, specifically among those younger adults. We don't see an effect in children, and we don't see a significant effect in adults over 40, though it's trending towards protective. So then adding effect modification by area deprivation index, where low is the least socioeconomic disadvantage and high is the most, and we've just split it into tertiles. We see that the signal in these young adults where we were seeing increased risk is really driven by patients coming from neighborhoods with high socioeconomic disadvantage. So you can see that here, where in the low disadvantage, the effect is null. Similarly in medium, though perhaps a dose-response relationship emerging where it's increasing towards statistically significant in this highest deprivation region. The null effect in kids is consistent across the area deprivation index strata. And then in adults, the potentially protective effect of increasing temperature becomes statistically significant only in regions with high area deprivation index, and that's seen over here. We're digging into that further now by looking at individual level socioeconomic factors rather than using ADI, so looking at disaggregated measures like employment status and trying to understand why we're seeing this somewhat surprising result in the adults over 40, where it looks like they have lower risk on hotter days. And that was my quick update. I don't know if Meredith has anything she wants to add before I turn it back to Ben.
No, thanks for presenting that. I think you really outlined some of the high points with the data, and happy to just invite discussion, I would say. I think raises several points, just thinking about the impact of age and how we might want to make sure to look for effect modification by age. And really, we still struggle to understand the signal in the over 40. We've talked about, and I know Emily's done some work in further stratifying this group by like different age windows, you know, within, for example, like the extreme elderly, I would expect to be more to have an excess risk with increases in heat, like has been shown in the literature. I believe the data isn't as robust, and so maybe from a sample size standpoint, we're less able to disentangle, for example, whether people over 65 or over 70 would have a different trend. Emily, I don't know if you want to comment on that further, but.
Yeah, we run into sample size and power problems, but it is something Aparna and I are working on, and looking at age continuously, for example, and incorporating those individual level socioeconomic variables to try to understand if there's a confounder driving this that we haven't accounted for yet. So all ongoing.
I think Ken was asking about the seasonality, and maybe just scroll down to, or scroll back up to the 2 and 3, or slide 1 and 2. That seasonal pattern is pretty well described in the literature. I will say, I don't know, you know, if I compare slide 2 to other prior published slides, the trends are the same, although I will say ours like seem especially dramatic. The spike in September has been well described in childhood asthma and is largely been attributed to return to school with the concept of kids, especially viral illnesses, spiking during this time. It's possible that, you know, allergen also may be another factor. For example, if kids are coming back to classrooms and you get sort of a mixture of allergens in classrooms that you might not otherwise be exposed to. For example, if if a child is allergic to cats, and then they go into a classroom where there's like a lot of cat dander that's been brought in by other children. But generally, this is thought to be related to viral illnesses that spike when kids go back to school and sort of mix amongst one another. For example, in like some trials, like there's a trial of Xolair medicine you might have heard of before, where they looked specifically at the impact in the false spike as one of their outcomes. So it's I would say like that well described. Yeah, and so does the level drop off in June because they leave school? That's a thought. And you can also look at this in like year-round school versus schools that have summer breaks, and yes, that is thought to be part of it. And I will say also during COVID, we've seen like dramatic reductions in flattening and asthma exacerbations, and that's also been seen in other respiratory conditions, but probably adding weight to the idea that reduction in exposure to any viral illness reduces asthma exacerbations. There are other common schools, as I mentioned, not just viruses, but that's thought to be the primary driver.
I saw a question about the exposure data and using PRISM. And so Bianca did really interesting work looking at more spatially resolved measures of heat. And she was able to find signals in T-min that I was not. And I think Ben can correct me if I'm paraphrasing wrong, but I think that's coming from nighttime cooling not being captured in the data that I'm using that's more coarse, where Bianca may be able to see sort of neighborhood level differences in what individuals are being exposed to, particularly where their sort of structural, their environment at night may impact the overnight cooling and the relief they get from that daytime heat. And it could be explaining why she's able to find significant differences, specifically in minimum temperature, where I'm only seeing it in those daytime maximum and mean temperatures. And so it is a limitation of using the data I used here. And Bianca she is doing really interesting work with looking at whether we can learn different things if we have more spatially resolved data for the exposure.
Yeah, I mean, they said it exactly right. And the interesting about Bianca stuff, so is that she uses high resolution data, ends up resolving the urban heat island, right, which is maximum at night, and then sees some interactions where maybe some of the more socially vulnerable populations in the inner city are being exposed to that elevated heat, and that's having an impact. The weird thing about Bianca stuff, as we try to understand things in these results, is that she still sees kind of similarly significant results for daytime heat when measured from the BWI weather station, and nighttime heat when measured using her estimates of local temperature high resolution. So it's not that the nighttime ends up being actually substantially more predictive. They're just differently predictive, and that's something that I think we're all collectively trying to understand. See that Dexter has his hand up.
Hey, good morning. This is awesome. Super interesting. Those first two slides, we already talked about the seasonality. There's an indoor-outdoor thing going on. Maybe a pollen thing wasn't mentioned. But the age is, I don't get it. Like, I would think that the young and the old would be more vulnerable. How is that? Yeah, so what are some of the other factors that might explain this counterintuitive relationship?
What about reliance on public transportation or something, needing to be outdoors in the heat? I don't know if we have good data on that, but certainly high school kids are taking the bus too, but I don't know.
Is your thought that this group, like 18 to 39, is using more public transportation?
That was the thought. So they're having to stand outside in the heat, waiting for a bus. In the pollution, in the heat, in the,
Yeah.
you know, and like the multitude of things that are worse on hot days. These kids might be just walking to, well, at least the younger kids walking to a local elementary school. Older adults might be able to hide out more inside.
We did look at this in COPD. We found that older adults were more impacted even with indoor heat, but they generally, like in our COPD studies, which are different, but I would expect like for people 60 and over would be pretty similar. What we found is those people really in extreme heat like tend to not go outside very much at all, like maybe not at all on a given day. But also that the heat inside their home does make a difference. So when we were able to like actually measure the heat inside their home, there was a signal. But my senses would be that if we could monitor this exposure, that there's a lot more indoor air conditioned time, right, among the 40 and up. But we don't have that measurement. Yeah. I would think still that that if we got into the more extreme of age, like 65 and over, I would still think that those individuals would look more like our 18 to 39 signal. But I'm not sure. I don't know that that's true in this data, but.
Look at the one that was stratified by ADI again too.
It's probably the most difficult to understand, right?
Everybody 18
Being
to
old and
follows
poor
the
is
expectations and everybody else does what they want. Very odd.
I don't know that we have very good, I don't think we have very good occupation data, at least at the, could probably go through it in a little more like a qualitative way, or, you know, trying to do something like natural language processing, but I don't believe we have good occupational variables right now. They may get better over time with increased emphasis and collecting data related to social determinants of health that has come into play in the EPIC databases, or but I still think we're the complexity of ascertaining occupation is challenging, and then also just the resolution of electronic health record data. I don't think that's been enough of a focus that we'll have good quality data anytime soon.
I don't think any doctor has ever asked me what I do for a living.
And if so, it's probably not like asking you in the right way.
Or it just comes up that I happen to work at Hopkins. Yeah.
Can you remind me also, in this data set, is this just Baltimore City or this Baltimore region? Like anybody showing up at Hopkins?
This is all of Maryland.
All of Maryland. Okay, but still limited to the people coming to Hopkins, right?
Correct, yeah. So
But any Hopkins, like
Any
Sibley,
Hopkins.
German.
Oh, right. So that's another difference, right? From Bianca's analysis. So that's kind of interesting, you know, thinking about the ADI. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, is it the problem is the data set is not huge, right? But like, are there ways that we could map this out, look at thresholds, just try to understand a little better where these people are? You know, one surprising thing we've seen, not in the health analysis, but in some of the other equity-oriented analyses we've done in the project, is that, for example, within the city, older populations sometimes are in the less deprived neighborhoods on average. And so then you end up with these counterintuitive results where it's like, oh, if you want to save a lot of people from heat, make sure you plant your trees up in Northwest or places where there's not a lot of ADI or low ADI. So I wonder if like it's just like looking, I know Emily already graduated, so this is all aspirational, right? But like looking at some of the spatial patterns in these results, or some of the sensitivity to thresholds, might help us understand exactly where these folks are that are driving the counterintuitive statistical answer.
yeah, we could. Would you? Okay, I'm just thinking about this. Would you be interested in their distance from their hospital, or would you be interested in the region of Maryland they're from, or a combination of the two? Or I'm just trying to think about the spatial layers to what might confound who's showing up for asthma exacerbation at a Hopkins hospital versus not. And if we're getting some selection bias that's influencing these results.
Yeah, I think we could spitball a few hypotheses, right? I think what you just said, both the distance from the hospital, right, and maybe the location. Dexter mentioned pollen, right, and things like this. So I wonder if I don't know what my leading hypothesis would be, but it might be something we could think through.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Did you plot where the people are on the, like, is it everybody in the low ADI lives in the county and everybody in the high ADI lives in the city?
I haven't made that plot, but it would be a very cool one, and I can do that before our next PIMCO call.
Yeah. In a couple months, I might be able to pull up with at least an SVI map that's of the whole Baltimore region, so we could take a look, see if it stands there.
There's also like a few ways you can define the urban rural like gradient. You might be able to then just make some histograms or something of, looking at ADI by urban status or something like that. Which maybe even looking at urbanicity as a separate analysis would be interesting too. A doctoral student in our department has been looking at that with health data for a different analysis. But if you don't know any of those metrics, let me know and I can look them back up what she's been using.
Yeah, I'm not familiar. That would be helpful if you could share.
Let's see what I can find.
All right. Well, thank you, Emily. About halfway through, we should probably hand it over, but I'm going to steal 30 seconds just to show this Baltimore Metro SVI since we're talking about it. So this is, I think this is like 2018 data, so we need to update it. But this is the social vulnerability index, which correlates in models with ADI at tract level for Baltimore and surrounding counties. And so not surprising, right? As someone just indicated, like, or Kirsten just said, like, are all the vulnerable people in the city? Well, not literally so, but if you could, then we could intersect this maybe with the patient representation map, right, in the data set and see if we're getting some interactions there between geography and vulnerability. So we could do.
That was really useful discussion. Thanks for everybody sharing those thoughts. So some direct things. So we'll do a sensitivity analysis or an exploratory of like Baltimore City versus non-Baltimore City. And then I really like the idea of the urban, rural, and everything in between. Because there could also be a signal at the other side where you could imagine like poor or rural. We've seen that with COPD, like having that be sort of also a vulnerability. There's a story in the field of asthma that has been looked at in children more, but less so adults. So there could be some, the data could tell us some things that are unique and helpful in the field.
Interesting. All right. That makes me think about some more things we could look at, but let's hand it over to biogeochemistry. We can follow up on that. So over to biogeochem. Who's leading us? John, are you going to lead us through this?
I think so, but I'm going to also ask if Kirsten, Ken, or Ben have anything to just jump on in, especially on the anthropogenic side of things. So let me just get this ready here. Okay. So yeah, formerly greenhouse gases. And hopefully everyone's got that in full screen mode.
Yeah, that's good.
So yeah, from the get-go, we kind of have had this natural divide in the group between those focusing on some of the anthropogenic inputs and controls, industry emissions, fossil fuels. And what I'll focus on today, I'll just give you some brief updates and kind of status, allowing friends and colleagues to jump in and give any updates they have on the science side, but just to get everyone's minds back around all that's going on within the biogeochemistry group. And then I'll give you some recent data updates on the biogenic side of things. So thanks to Ken and Ben for the map of where things stand. You know, Ben has been hard at work trying to get these towers instrumented and stood up as part of BSEC, but also taking care to integrate some of what's coming down the pike with Courage, some of what NIST has, and trying to think about the spatiality of where these towers are. Most of these are CO2 in terms of the greenhouse gas fluxes. There's at least one doing methane. And, you know, partly what this is the task at hand for BSEC is trying to make sense of where these are, what they're representing, given that we've got a bunch of different networks coming together. The next slide, I think, is going to be on Kirsten's network, Kirsten and colleagues' network. And then the biogenic side, we're in yet still different locations. But these are going to be very useful as we try to think about upscaling and partitioning what these towers are seeing. I'll just pause for a quick second to see if Ben or Ken have anything to add here. And we can certainly come back towards the end in discussion as well. So I think everyone knows, but Kirsten is working with Scott Miller and Xiaolun Li, and they're putting together some of Kirsten's network, this search network, measuring concentrations. These are not fluxes, important to note, but that's where partnership with atmospheric scientists can really help, trying to resolve some of these and see about converting these concentrations to fluxes, depending on the question at hand. But this has been, I think, by most standards, a lower cost network, measuring a bunch of things at many locations. And so the list there from their slide in terms of what's there and location of where these sites are. So again, this is part of the building blocks and different pieces of these data sets that we've got across BSEC. Kirsten, anything to add? I know that, you know, I'm not
I
giving
mean, we could
research.
talk about specific challenges of calibrating the greenhouse gases later, but
Okay, which I know is an in-depth piece of this. Yeah. And that gets back to the low cost nature of these, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So making sure the data are representing what you think you're measuring. Absolutely. And then I'll just go a little bit more deeply into the biogenic fluxes. Peter's given some of this, but Peter Groffman at City University of New York, through the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, has long-term monthly data. So this is CO2, N2O, and methane fluxes using the kind of traditional ecological in situ chamber methods, thinking about things across the urban gradient. And they've been doing this since 1998 in rural forests out in Baltimore County, up in the Oregon Ridge Park, grass areas at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, differing riparian sites, and then stormwater infrastructure. So I'll have a couple of slides from Peter on that. And then short-term dynamics is exclusively BSEC funded. This is also following the same trace gases, CO2, N2O, and methane, using these LICOR backpacks that are pictured there. And so this is optical feedback cavity enhanced absorption spectroscopy, excuse me, allowing for really careful low-level concentration measurements and getting those into fluxes. So we've been targeting a watershed just into Baltimore County. It's within the Dead Run watershed in Catonsville, Maryland, because we had an NSF project there where we had extensive instrumentation for soil moisture and soil oxygen at nested depths. So we've got a pretty detailed understanding of the hydrology there. Claire Welty at UMBC has also had more than a decade's worth of high frequency continuous data for stream flow, for water quality, and other things. So in that short-term dynamics, I'll show you some very fresh data from riparian zones that are incised. So they're cut more deeply. The streams are cut more deeply into the landscape. For those not familiar with incision, and then there's more incised, right? We really don't have a well-connected floodplain here, given the urban stream syndrome. We've also got some sites in a forest patch interior, a site on the forest patch edge. We've been targeting stormwater pond, the edge of the pond, as well as over the open water, and then in turf grass. So Peter's data here is, if we look at the methane, and he's grouping things by year since 98 to recent, looking at methane first. Blue dots are the rural forests, so out in the county, urban forest sites within the city in orange, and then the turf grass in green. And you can see those methane fluxes vary with land use and with time, but there's obviously a distinct offset between these. So higher fluxes out of the urban grasslands, of course. And so this is really useful long-term data to contextualize and think about things as we get these short-term campaigns from BSEC. Looking at the N2O data from Peter, these vary more with time than land use. And so, showing these interannual trends here are useful to Peter as he's been trying to contextualize this and write this up, and thinking about how this varies from the methane. But there's also this notion that, or the results that there's some variation within land use. And so these are breaking down by sites there that you can see. I didn't go in to create maps of where these sites are, but there's some interesting differences here with land use. And so this was one of the reasons that led us to really try to target some of the campaigns that we're doing in Catonsville. And I'll get to that in just a second. But with methane flux, there's this big difference in natural and engineered interfaces. So where the streams and waters are meeting the land seems to be an incredibly important hotspot, especially for methane. And so this is another aspect that not a ton of other studies have looked at yet in terms of really being able to resolve these greenhouse gas fluxes from stormwater infrastructure. They're doing lots of great things, potentially with mitigation of flooding, but there's also some potentially unintended consequences here with methane fluxes out of detention ponds, for instance. Also thinking about what's happening at this stream-land interface is really important as we scale up our understanding from these point scale measurements. So this is a map of the Catonsville watershed. For those in the know, this is within the Dead Run Franklintown site. This is a headwater site called DR5. That was Claire's numbering scheme when she started this 15-ish years ago. And so Gabrielle Pezich, master student here at Penn State, has started monthly sampling this past winter, and has really just recently, within the last week, started the goals of trying to target hot spots and hot moments. These hot moments where there's a disproportionate flux of these gases happens following storm events. And so again, looking at that within this context of, given Peter's results, focusing on this riparian zone, as well as the stormwater infrastructure, forest patch edge, and interior. So these are all closely located. This is a decent amount of work to have 2 of those 20-pound backpacks getting in there and in and out of sites. But at each of these locations, there are at least 3 soil collars, so we're getting some replication from within a given site to have some variability captured there. So as I mentioned, this is hot off the presses. So last Friday, there was a bit of a cloud burst that led to that stormwater peak or discharge peak on May 17th. And Gabrielle was down there following that to sample in 3 sequential days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, just to look to see when we should be targeting, when do we leave State College to get down to Baltimore to capture some of this data. So this is basically a base flow, but after a wet up, and this is following that bigger storm that came down May 13 and 14. And so apologies, the font's a little bit small here, but this is looking by sites. So they're grouped into floodplain here. This is a restored floodplain. There was a stream restoration that was completed by Baltimore County in 2018. And so looking at that, it's engineered and it's a bit artificial in that it's been created recently, but that floodplain is better connected with the stream over on the left-hand side. The forest exterior patch, forest interior, the lawns over the stormwater pond, the pond site, which is here meaning the edge of the stormwater pond, and the riparian zone. And so as we start here by looking at the CO2 fluxes, you'll note that, and this does include the last several monthly samples that we've been able to capture, as well as those 3 sequential days from this past week. The riparian zones are straddling, there's more points there. We've got a few because we're also including, again, remember the incised versus non-incised, but the variability of those riparian sites essentially encompass and bracket almost everything else, except some of the negative fluxes over the stormwater pond. And so some really interesting implications here as we think about the structure of the landscape, how incised these urban streams are into the landscape, and the corresponding greenhouse gas fluxes from those locations. If we look at methane here, things are really driven by that stormwater pond and one point there. But if we were to zoom in and put this on a log scale or put this on a log scale on the y-axis, we'd also see that the overwater fluxes and the stormwater pond edge have by far the highest methane fluxes to be expected, but they're quite a bit higher. And so as we think about going from this one pond to the extent to which we can kind of spatially extrapolate here and scale this up over our study domain, there are an incredible number of these stormwater ponds. And so it's going to be a really important aspect to think about how they're engineered. This one in particular was designed to hold water, and so there's always surface water in it, as opposed to other ponds that were designed and engineered to dry out. But thinking about those differences will be important as we think about the regional scale implications of this type of data. And then the N2O fluxes by site, again, you can see that riparian zone. Again, there's 4 sites there, but it's really bracketing all of the other data. And so depending on its incision level and what's flowing into that riparian zone from upstream land use, there's a large degree of variability. And so this has been a really important consideration for us and is really kind of influencing where we go next and how many other dimensions do we need to consider here for explaining the variability in those fluxes. I don't have data here to show it for today, but just as context, we selected this site because of the NSF project that we have that is allowing us to look at nested depth soil moisture and soil oxygen at 4 different riparian locations here within this watershed. And so what we're starting to work on this summer as well is looking at the antecedent conditions, how dry was the soil before the storm hits? What is the soil oxygen looking like up and down the profiles? We've got 3 depths at those 4 sites. And so we've got some additional information here to help us better understand the physics of what's driving these greenhouse gases. So lots going on. We're continuing to target these hot moments. So basically heading down after it rains this summer and really trying to get more data from each of these plots. We're still looking for homeowner lawn sites. The lawns that we've captured are minimally managed, I'll say. One is in a cemetery and one is in a neighborhood park, and differing dynamics and fluxes from what we've seen so far, but we are still on the hunt. And thanks to Mac for hooking us up with some connections with the neighborhood association. So fingers crossed that something will work out there. And then as a team, we've got some meetings planned, and looking forward to the all hands, of course, to continue integrating across the anthropogenic and biogenic sources of this. And then there's huge opportunities to take this data and see how we might better work with our modeling colleagues on BSEC, Rhesus, and Elm, potentially others as well, and thinking about how this data could help constrain, help calibrate, or reconsider some of our approaches as we think about upscaling and partitioning sources. So I've been noticing that there's some chats. I haven't been following those, but I'll open it up for I guess, any input from Kirsten, Ken, or Ben.
Ken and I were just chatting on the side about whether the search network might be able to see these hot moments in the methane signal or not.
Yeah.
That were like right on your natural areas. Very interesting to see.
It is challenging. And, there's one of the tensions that we have definitely been feeling here is, so Gabrielle is a master's student and trying to make sure she's got coherent data to kind of chase down some of these hypotheses that we've been thinking about, given that we've got the existing data at this watershed. But how does this vary from interurban sites? And, might there be campaigns? We had talked with Megan Avolio and others on the vegetation and soils team about, do we try to get some of these collars installed at their kind of more inner city veg and soil sites? And do we try to even get like one campaign this summer where we get at least some of this data? But yeah, and that might better link to the search network.
I'll jump in. I was slow to the trigger when you said my name earlier. Sorry, John.
No, no worries.
For one, if anybody has any questions about various Flux Tower stuff, please let me know. The other thing I guess I wanted to mention was we had a meeting with the public golf course organization, the managers of the public golf courses, and they were pretty keen to help. I'm not sure if that would help with your like hot, more intensively managed turf sites. They had some options. I was looking at them for Flux Tower locations, and there just wasn't anything of the right size. But for your kind of thing, that would be potentially more doable. But we can follow up on that.
Great. Thanks so much.
If it's of interest, I could give a quick description of some of what we learned with anthropogenic emissions recently, but the speaker is taking the long weekend, the creator. But let's go for questions for John first.
And it would be just interesting, looking at the chats here within the search network, given that it is much more Baltimore City, are there any trends following a storm event? That would be presumably easy to pick out, or a straightforward thing to look at.
If it's
Immediately, you mean within hours?
Well, that's partly what we're trying to sort through here. And we don't have enough data from these sites, but the literature suggests that it's many hours to days following, given some of the automated approaches, right? The auto chamber approach. And it depends on lots of factors, what the available, nitrogen is for N2O, for instance. But yeah, multiple hours to days following storm events.
Hey, John, you may not have enough data to set up an additional part of a factorial design, but does position relative to large sources of N2O, as an example, would you expect that to show up? Particularly high arterial roads, DR5 is right on the side of 695. Others are more remote, and we will see a large drop off in end deposition with
So
distance from these high arterial roads, depending on predominant wind directions.
right. And so that it's tough to get the full factorial design, right? And it likely depends on wind direction, and we're probably not on the correct side of the
Yeah.
Baltimore Beltway. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse
Yeah.
tracing, but um, that's the Baltimore Beltway. One of these lawn sites is a cemetery immediately off of the sound barrier from 695.
Mhm.
The other yellow dot interior to this is at the edge of the neighborhood park. And so that's what we've got. But that was certainly a question in terms of yeah, how to tease that apart. It's just, yeah, it's challenging to try to uh, design that accordingly, where we can also get down and get all of these sites. We're trying to control for making sure we can get to all of these sites on a single day.
Mhm.
I think the other thing to be thinking about, Larry, is, Rhesus does not have greenhouse gases, but how do some of the states that Rhesus is able to simulate correlate and work with this? Could this
Yeah.
be
Well,
conceived?
remember, we've already done some comparisons with soil CO2 efflux from Rhesus
Right.
with some of the chamber data. Uh, N2O, we run a denitrification, but we'd have to have resolve that into complete and incomplete denitrification. For that, we're working to develop a methane model, working with
Okay.
Chang in our department.
Great.
I guess a wider question for the air quality monitoring group: are you looking at distance from arterial roads? So there's a larger sampling there.
So I'll defer to other folks that know better, but I know Pete DiCarlo and others had taken a couple of trips. They'd hooked in the mobile lab, I think, and were basically getting longitudinal driving patterns. They'd done this a couple of times. I'm not sure that that's the perfect data set, but it's one thing that I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Does let you look at gradients more clearly.
Right.
All right. Any other questions for John or other comments on the biogeochemistry results? All right. Thanks so
Hopefully
much,
we'll
John. Really
have,
cool to see some. Oh, good. Yeah.
I was just going to say, hopefully we'll have a lot more to say on these hot moments by the end of the summer.
Yeah. No, it's just so cool to see these data. I had not seen some of that, those results, and it's exciting. All right. In that case, thank you to our speakers. We're going to see hopefully most of the people on this call in just 3 weeks or so at the BSEC annual research meeting. So looking forward to having further discussion of these results and much more when we see you there. And until then, thanks again. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks all.
Thanks.